Before I invite George to introduce the speakers, I'm going to say a few words on behalf of South Asia Solidarity Group, which is co-hosting this book launch, along with the Center for Palestine Studies and the Department of Development Studies here at SOAS. South Asia Solidarity Group is very delighted to be co-hosting the book launch of this really important and exciting new book, Hostile Homelands, the new alliance between India and Israel, and is excited to welcome the author Azad Essa to London. We in South Asia Solidarity Group are committed to amplifying voices of people's movements for democracy and for justice, and supporting resistance to fascism, imperialism, and war in South Asia. In recent years, much of our energies have gone into challenging the Brahmanical Hindutva supremacist forces of Narendra Modi and the RSS and its fascist ideology both in India and here in the Indian diaspora in the UK. Both in India and in diaspora, the alliance with Israel, which Azad Essa has researched so meticulously, is critical. Israel and Zionism has been a model as well as a powerful ally for Hindutva supremacists. This month marks the 75th anniversary of the mass and deliberate displacement of Palestinians known as Nakba, or the catastrophe. As an anti-imperialist organization, it goes without saying that we have been always committed to a free Palestine and have been part of the campaign against Israel as an apartheid regime. In South Asia, we have seen the methods of occupation and repression being copied in Kashmir. Of course, Kashmir has its own history, but the manner in which Kashmir has been violently thrown into a dark existential crisis makes it hard for anyone not to draw parallels. We in South Asia Solidarity Group have supported the Kashmiri people's right to self-determination for several decades and will continue to do so in this new phase which many have termed settler-colonialism. Today we will also be hearing from Mirza Saaib Beg, with whom we have been working since the abrogation of Article 370 in 2019, when we held a series of mass protests in London. If you would like to know more about us, about South Asia Solidarity Group, or if you want to get involved, please do follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We're not on TikTok anymore, but maybe soon. We're very happy to have with us today as chair of the event, Dr. Nathaniel George of the Center for Palestine Studies. Dr. Nathaniel George is a lecturer in politics of Middle East at SOAS, University of London. He's a global political historian of the modern Arab world and United States foreign relations. His research and teaching focuses on the relationship between revolution, counter-revolution, sectarianism, and the empire. So I'll now hand over to him.
Azad Essa, and published this year by Pluto Press. From my perspective as a scholar on the Arab world, Hostile Homelands is an important intervention in contemporary debates that reminds us of the stakes of Palestine beyond Palestine. After all, the question of Palestine is not merely a local conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, limited to the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Neither is it an Arab-Israeli conflict, understood as a curious regional quarrel between Israel and its bordering Arab states. Rather, the question of Palestine is a central piece of a global political struggle over the strengths and limits of settler colonialism, empire, self-determination, and popular sovereignty. Hostile Homelands contributes to such an understanding by mapping out the politics and international relations of India and Israel, and indeed their growing alliance. Essa shows us that Israel and India are two important nodes in the growing network of ethno-nationalist social movements and political regimes across the globe. A major thread running through the book is the importance of imperial policy, notably that of Britain and the United States, in inspiring, cultivating, and materially supporting such racist ethno-nationalist movements such as Zionism and Hindutva. In the early 20th century, after all, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire provided game-changing support for Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine as a means of better dominating the vastly more numerous native Arab population. In much the same way, at the same time, British authorities aided the nascent Hindu nationalist movement against the more secular, inclusive, and anti-imperialist project of the Indian National Congress led by Gandhi and Nehru. After the foundation of the Indian and Israeli states, following these imperially licensed partitions, ethnic cleansing, and Nakba, or catastrophe, ambitious statesmen in both states would increasingly, albeit at different tempos, cultivate close political ties than with the United States. In teaming up with the world hegemon, both Israeli and Indian ethno-nationalist rulers in power can feel confident in pursuing their discriminatory and often illegal policy agenda with impunity. Alliances, after all, tell us a lot about the value and aims of political movements. As the American socialist and labor leader Eugene Debs memorably once put it in a speech attacking the imperialist perpetrators of the First World War, birds of a feather flock together. So we will begin tonight by opening the floor to the author, Azad Essa, who will present on his book for 10 to 12 minutes or so. After his presentation, our respondents, Amrit Wilson and Mirza Saaib Beg, will each pose 2 to 3 questions to launch our discussion. Finally, we will then open up the forum to the audience for questions and answers. So about tonight's speakers. Azad Essa is a journalist and author based in New York. He's currently a senior reporter for Middle East Eye, covering U.S. foreign policy, Islamophobia, and race in the U.S. He is the author of Zuma's Bastard, a collection of essays exploring life as a Muslim South African navigating post-apartheid South Africa and the post-9/11 world. The book was published in India as The Muslims Are Coming by HarperCollins. Prior to joining Middle East Eye, between 2010 and 2018, he worked for Al Jazeera English, reporting from across the African continent, as well as South Asia, covering politics, development, and poverty. He has also covered diverse issues. For example, Azad's 4-part investigation into the predatory behavior of peacekeepers in war zones is titled, "Why Do Some Peacekeepers Rape?" And it won the 2017 UN Correspondents Association International Prize Silver Award for coverage on UN activities. In 2019, his investigation into systemic targeting and murder of people of albinism in Malawi was turned into primary advocacy material for Amnesty International. A year later, his short film for Al Jazeera on the Indian authorities' destructive use of pellet guns in occupied Kashmir won gold at the Telly Awards in 2020. Azad has also written for Al Jazeera, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and The Guardian. Responding to him tonight is Amrit Wilson, a writer, journalist, and activist and co-founder of the South Asia Solidarity Group. Her books include Finding a Voice, Asian Women in Britain, which won the Martin Luther King Award in 1978 and was republished in an updated edition in 2018. Challenge Road, Women in the Eritrean Revolution, published by Africa World Press in 1991, and U.S. Foreign Policy and Revolution, The Creation of Tanzania, published by Pluto in 1989. She writes and comments about race and gender in the UK and about Indian politics. Our second respondent is Mirza Saaib Beg, a lawyer from Kashmir. He was awarded the Kofi Annan Scholarship at Mansfield College and at the Wiedenfield Hoffman Scholarship at the Blavatnik School of Government, both at the University of Oxford. He holds a postgraduate degree in law and a postgraduate degree in public policy. He regularly writes and comments on legal and political issues concerning Kashmir. Finally, I'd like to thank Amrit and the South Asia Solidarity Group for taking the initiative and organizing this event. And without further ado, please welcome Azad Essa.
Doing a slideshow. At the last moment I decided I would try, but the intelligence agencies have blocked my password. Okay, it's pretty I think it works out better this way. So thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you to Amrit, the South Asian Solidarity Group, for talking with me over the last few months about arranging something like this. Thank you to Nate, thank you to Mirza. Thank you, Darud, for the introduction. I'm going to try and keep this presentation to like 8 to 10 minutes. It's really, really short and sweet. Okay, not so sweet, but close to that. I understand many of you haven't read the book, and so I hope, of course, that you will. And I thought, given that you may not have read the book, I would try to give you a quick introduction about what the book is about, what it kind of deals with. And so then you could essentially better follow the conversation to come. I'm obviously excited to be here, and given that this is the first event in the UK about this book, and being in the UK is especially important given the source of all of this trouble in the first place. And so, yeah, I'm really grateful that you all came by. So, as a quick background to myself, so I was born in South Africa in the early 80s and grew up obviously as a young person as this apartheid, this anti-apartheid movement grew and calls for boycott and sanctions, reached the climax, and the calls for Nelson Mandela to be released also reached the kind of apex. And growing up from a family of like South Asian origin, meaning Indian origin, as we are known in South Africa, even though there was no India before that, but when they came in the 1920s. We grew up with a certain idea of how India had played a role, a major role, a premier role in the anti-apartheid movement in the late 40s. So for instance, in 1946, even before India becomes a country, the Indian National Congress passed a resolution pushing for sort of like a boycott on South Africa because of their racist policies. Of course, this is even before apartheid comes into being, which is in 48. So the Indian government were like on the ball in the late 40s. And growing up as a young person, you hear, our lives changed obviously in South Africa after 1990. You think about Mandela being released, and then the first country that breaks the boycott, that ends the boycott, is India, the sports boycott, and that's India again. And it invites South Africa for a cricket tournament in '91. And this idea that you start growing up with is that normalization or things changing only happens when some concession takes place. You don't change things unless something changes. After '94, Mandela continues to talk about Palestine, famously speaking or mentioning in '97 that our freedom is not complete. So when without the freedom of the Palestinians, so you grow up with this idea that this project of freedom, as incomplete and as warped as it is in South Africa, in several ways, this project of freedom is not complete unless everyone is free, and you grow up with that, and you kind of like start imbibing those ideas, especially if you're interested in those topics, and not becoming an accountant. What happens after that is I'm introduced to the story of Kashmir as a graduate student, and that kind of cracks open my idea of India. And it makes me rethink everything that I ever thought about. So I think to myself, like, if India is supposedly such a pro-Palestine supporter, how is it that it can be also running its own occupation at the same time while speaking about apartheid, while speaking about Palestine? And so this sort of forced me into like a rabbit hole of trying to understand what's the story about India. And unfortunately, the things you discover becomes a bit sad. So for instance, the 1946 story I told you, the Indian National Congress didn't speak about racism for all people. It spoke about racism against Indian people in South Africa. It only comes in the 1950s that it says, oh, actually, the majority of people in South Africa are black, and so we actually need to talk about them too. So there's this duplicity that becomes a running theme, you know. And then you have figures like Mahatma Gandhi and you have Nehru, in which this sort of foreign policy is not seen as a realist policy. It's not seen as a written or pushed across as a kind of, you know, a policy that's in the self-interest of a country, but it's pushed across as a kind of moralistic policy. And that kind of sticks no matter what happens through the years. So, long story short, with regards to the background, is that this pushes me also then to go to Palestine, and then I immediately see the connection between Palestine and Kashmir, and this book kind of has its origins there in terms of my understanding of India, my understanding of India's relationship with apartheid, and this pushing back against apartheid, and then its sort of pro-Palestine position. And what, you know, I'm trying to understand the relationship between all of these things. And so the book starts there. So the 5 arguments that I make in this book is that firstly, as you can guess, India's so-called pro-Palestine position was a lot more complicated than it first appears. It was driven in large part by self-interest. So India understood that there was a certain currency in being pro-Palestine at the time. It didn't hurt that it would assist in securing energy from the Arab world and ensure that the Arab world didn't take Pakistan's side on the question of Kashmir. In fact, you know, just building on that, it's extraordinary how India has been able to exceptionalize its policies based on its relationship and its leadership to the non-aligned movement. So again, another story about the non-aligned movement is that in the 1950s, you have India as a co-founder, and the non-aligned movement rejects Israel's entry, you know, into this club against imperialism. And so our assumption is that because India was a leader of the non-aligned movement and Israel was not part of it, then we see it as India being one of the countries that didn't want Israel there. But when you look deeper into the topic or into the story, we find that actually Nehru kind of was open to Israel coming to the non-aligned movement, and it was only when the Arab countries and Indonesia itself said, we don't want Israel here, that Nehru backed down. So in the popular, you know, narration of it is that non-aligned movement doesn't allow Israel. India was the leader of non-aligned movement, therefore, you know. And a lot of the scholarship about India and India's relationship with Palestine has been built on that popular mythology. You know, it's not, it hasn't been done in a rigorous manner, and it has suited people, you know, to do that. The second argument, and let's close on this point, is that India's relationship with Israel, though it might have accelerated with Modi, I mean, really accelerated, it didn't start with him. And I think this is really, really important. It starts in 1950 when India recognizes Israel. It doesn't implement sort of diplomatic ties at the time. It takes 2 years for India to allow Israel to open a consular office. And it's not really a consular office, it's kind of like an immigration office in Bombay. It's far away from Delhi. But this relationship in the early 60s starts taking on like a life of its own, because you see India reaching out to several countries, including Israel, and asking for weapons, asking for help with weapons. And now again with the duplicity regarding Nehru. In 1962, India goes to war with China in the Himalayas, and they're having a hard time dealing with the Chinese military. So Nehru writes a letter to a raft of leaders around the world, and he says, could you please obviously assist us? And Ben Gurion replies and says, yes, I will assist. What do you need? And Nehru replies saying, I want X, Y, Z, mortars and other things. And when you send this material, please make sure that you don't put your Israeli flag on the ship. Like, please put it on an unmarked ship. And Ben Gurion basically refuses, and India takes the weapons. And Gamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt hears about this deal, and he basically tells Nehru, can you please stop? So officially they stop, but they don't stop. They get weapons in 65 against Pakistan, they get weapons in 71 also against Pakistan. And so this relationship builds and moves, and it's pretty much based and characterized on a military relationship. So the same period in which Yasser Arafat and Indira Gandhi were meeting publicly, and Yasser Arafat came to India many times, and he called Indira Gandhi like my sister. The same time this was happening, Indira Gandhi set up ties between Mossad and RAW, the Indian intelligence agency, and it was based out of her office. You might remember that India voted for 3379, Resolution 3379 in General Assembly in 1975, which means that they voted for Zionism to be characterized or seen as racism. And when Israel demanded in the early 90s that this be sort of revoked, India voted to repeal it, and without Zionism changing. Zionism 1975 is not different from Zionism 1991. But India's interests changed in 1991. So the funny thing is, I mentioned to you again that South Africa, in my understanding as a child, that you have to make concessions have to take place, changes have to take place before you normalize. India normalized with South Africa after Nelson Mandela was released, but they also normalized with Israel without anything happening, because the interests changed at the time. And the crucial part of this argument is that pinning all of this on Modi is incorrect. This all happened under Congress. And part of that argument, in terms of the interest, is about Congress's interest in joining the global capitalist economy. The third argument is about Zionism and Hinduism and the similarities that they share. And in a nutshell, both are exclusionary, both are expansionists, both instrumentalize religion, both seek to build nations with a single sort of culture, language, religion. Both weaponize any criticism of the ideologies as kind of Hinduphobia or anti-Semitism. Zionism is the basis of the Israeli state, and Hindutva is also fundamental to the larger Indian project. It's just that when it comes to India, it just took a little longer for it to emerge in a mass way. The fourth argument is about the Indian diaspora, and I can't comment too much for the British side of this discussion, but in the US, the pro-Hindutva and Zionist lobbies are working extremely close to each other. Extremely close, and they continue to align their projects with US power. And the diaspora angle is very important because it's this relationship that has pretty much explains the development of the past 10 years. It also explains, even in the British context, I suppose, the kind of brazenness that you see from the Hindu nationalist lobby wherever they are. So you've seen the events in Leicester, and likewise in Edison, New Jersey. You might have heard of a bulldozer that was roaming the streets during a pro-India or Indian independence rally. It also explains how India and Israel became closer during this time. And the fifth and final argument to intervention regards the occupations of Palestine and Kashmir. They aren't the same, and the book doesn't argue that they are the same. And I don't think anyone actually argues that, but fundamentally, whereas Israel argues that Palestinians want to destroy Israel, India argues that Kashmir is an integral part of India and its identity. And it doesn't matter if it's a right-wing Hindu nationalist or if it's a secular nationalist in India. So for a secular nationalist, India is an integral part of the country, and it's also part of the definition of India being a secular state. To lose Kashmir, to lose the biggest or the only Muslim majority state, would make India, lose its secular credentials. And for the Hindu nationalists, they see Kashmir as the crown of India. And to lose Kashmir would be to, chop it off. And it's the same with Zionism, when we're talking about labor Zionism, when we're talking about revisionism. And then we talk about tactics. So for decades, Israel and India have been using very similar tactics. So these include collective punishment, maiming. In Kashmir they use pellets to blind protesters. In Great March of Return, you saw Israeli snipers, shooting Palestinians in the limbs. Both sides don't return bodies of fighters, or if you show any sympathy to a fighter, your house is going to be bulldozed. Both criminalize civil society, and both have suppressed and also criminalized the media, and both control the movement of people. In Palestine, we're talking about the ID card that determines where you can go and where you can't. And in Kashmir, it's the soldier that determines that. In the end, it's the same thing. Now India wants to build settlements in Kashmir, and they have openly spoken about their desire to replicate the Israeli model regarding that. And both are using sort of counterinsurgency and surveillance policies, and they're relying on each other. Relying on each other and using methods for export to other authoritarian regimes elsewhere. So much so that the Palestine model is being taken to Kashmir, and the Kashmir model is being taken to India, essentially. And we'll see more of that. So the book is, you could say, it's like, it's supposed to be a resource for journalists. It's supposed to be a resource for researchers, for activists, for perhaps policymakers, anyone who's interested in having sort of like a dialogue about democracy, freedom, the kind of lies that we tell each other, the kind of lies that we continue to repeat. The story of India and Israel is not about just India and Israel. It's about, the weapons industry. It's about hyper-capitalism. It's about upper caste Hindus in Britain or in India or in the US, many of whom have an obsession with being white adjacent. It's about the half-baked stories we talk about, or we tell about Gandhi or Nehru, and how these sort of have been instrumentalized in keeping populations at bay, not just in India or anywhere else, but like in South Asia also. When you think about the narratives about the rest of South Asia, it's completely dominated by an Indian narrative. It's also about how these myths are created and amplified and repeated, India is pretty much on the verge of fascism, but if you look at the media, I don't know much about, I do, but I don't want to make too many assumptions, but if you look at the US media, you wouldn't know it if you're looking at the media in the US. Everything is about China, and India is completely aligned with that project, which means that not much information comes out. So, that's my short intervention, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
That was a very interesting outline of a truly fascinating book. And as Azad said, what is really striking about this is the meticulous detail with which it's written about a whole range of subjects. I mean, it covers a vast area. And of course, you know, we're holding this meeting here today, but we have to be aware that this, I mean, the diaspora itself is a site of struggle. And in fact, Saaib and I were just talking before the meeting. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Saaib and I were just chatting before the meeting, and we were remembering a conference which we held just after, in the October of 2019, after the abrogation of Article 370, and it was about Kashmir. And halfway through the conference, a number of masked men with slogans written on their clothes saying "Gay for JNK" walked in and started shouting and tried to disrupt the meeting, and then went out turning the fire alarm on. Well, we went out and carried on the meeting outside and came back with far more students who'd been outside. But the thing is that this really goes to the whole question of pinkwashing, which also is something which Azad has written about and which I think we'll be discussing later. But I'd like to start off with talking about something which has been in the news quite recently, and that is Adani, who really, Gautam Adani, who has bankrolled Modi over a long period and who has stood with Modi through thick and thin. And Adani has recently been exposed as the biggest fraud in corporate history. And his shares are plummeting, his personal wealth is going, he used to be the third richest man in the world. Now it's gone down by, I think it's less than half of what it was. But through this, the one man who has one international figure who stood by him is Netanyahu. And he has reassured him that his projects in Israel will go ahead as planned. And one of them is the Haifa port. And so I would really like to know from Azad, what is the significance of the Haifa port? And what's happening around there? And also in that context, what is the significance of this new so-called I2U2, which is Israel and India, America and the UAE? So in what way does this new organization cement these alliances of corporate capital? So.
Thank you, Amrit. Now, should we take Mirza's response to it, and then you can respond to both of them?
Thank you for the introduction to your book, and I think it's a very important challenge to the narrative that is created through Israel, through India, about respective populations which challenge their authorities. And just taking up from where Amrit was discussing, at SOAS right now, when we entered today, it reminded me of the event that I organized just about a month and a half after the amendment of Article 370, where these men barged into the room and started trying to brandish everyone in that room as regressive or homophobic. And something that you also mentioned in the discussion at the beginning was that there's a moment that cracked your idea of India. And I think that for a large audience that is outside India, there is a perception of what India stands for or what India is. And it kind of reflects how good India has been at projecting its soft power into creating its perception about what they stand for: diversity, multiculturalism, multiple ethnic groups over there, supposedly living, getting along together. But it takes a little while to pierce that perception and understand what's going on underneath the surface. So I wanted to take up from that to touch upon how Israel and India manipulate language to control the perception of those who are challenging their authority. specifically with respect to pink washing, for example, on Kashmir, when these men barged in, and in many places around the world, there was a narrative that was built, especially outside India, that Article 370 was promoting criminalization of homosexuality, and therefore it needed to go in order to decriminalize homosexuality. Now, from a legal perspective, for those who aren't aware, the position was incorrect in law, even under India's own legal structure. But the perception was being created like that. And they also extended it towards other progressive rights, seemingly progressive rights, saying that women don't have a right to property in Kashmir, and therefore this needs to go. So I wanted to take up from there and get your insight on how you see the weaponization of seemingly progressive language, which both states seem to project with the intention of protecting the vulnerable, but at the same time dehumanizing local populations.
Very easy question. Hello. Yeah. So who should answer first? I'll go with you. So the I2U2, it's probably the stupidest name, stands for India, Israel, UAE, and the US. And essentially, it's the West Asian bloc. And I guess there's two parts to your question. One is about Haifa Port, and one is about I2U2. So the I2U2, the West Asian bloc, was pretty much created in a way to counter China and China's rising influence in the Middle East. And when we say China's rising influence in the Middle East, we're talking about the economic influence, and we're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. And so this is essentially a way of, pooling resources, pooling kind of the capital of the UAE, the infrastructural sort of skills of India, and the tech skills from Israel, and the startup, that so-called genius of Israel, and bringing that together under the protection, in a way, of the US. You could have a larger conversation about where that goes, but Haifa Port is essentially the first kind of product of that relationship. I2U2, sorry, the West Asia bloc, I can't mention that, it just makes me laugh. The West Asian bloc was announced in July, and a few hours later, July 2022, and a few hours later, they mentioned that the Haifa Port was going to be sold. And it was sold for like $1.something billion. And it had essentially seen this Gautam Adani beat the Chinese and beat the United Arab Emirates as well from buying this port. And this port is so significant. If you ask any Palestinian about the port and about Haifa, Haifa is extremely productive port for the Israelis. Under the British Mandate Palestine, Haifa Port was also seen as sort of like the gateway to the east. And there were like railway tracks that were put down going to Iraq to get oil from Iraq, and obviously all of this ended after 48. What this means is that with India buying the port, or an Indian company buying the port, they are essentially helping Israel integrate into the Middle East. So it kind of builds on the sort of the political project of the Abraham Accords, in which these countries now, have deals and diplomatic ties with each other, and now you have this, this Indian port that essentially, this Indian-owned port, in conjunction with the Israeli company as well, which then allows Israel to have easier relations economically with the rest of the Middle East. Now, part of that is that they're going to build, and they spoke about that recently, I think you're referring to that, is that they're going to build a railway track all the way from Haifa to Saudi Arabia and possibly to the UAE as well. And the idea behind that is that you make Haifa port into a kind of Dubai, a kind of like hub in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so goods that come from the East will come to Saudi and come to UAE, and then they'll be put onto trains and be sent to Haifa. When they get to Haifa, they go to Europe, they go to Greece, and they go to the rest of the West. And you don't need to go through the Suez Canal anymore. So Egypt is a revolution in this, and you might have noticed that Sisi actually went to Egypt, went to India recently, and we just have to wonder what they spoke about. But that's what it is, and it's pretty much like the Haifa port is such a huge story because it also talks about the UAE. The Haifa port is also another kind of metaphor because it also represents sort of like other companies and countries investing in other people's occupations, basically. So India is now investing in Haifa, which means now there's an Indian flag outside Haifa port. So is Israel in charge of the Haifa port or is India? So now suddenly you're diffusing responsibility also. Everyone's now part of the occupation. The Indians are part of the occupation. There's an Indian flag outside Haifa port today. At the same time, you look at Kashmir, and you have a UAE company that's the first company to invest in Kashmir since like 2019. So now UAE is also now in Kashmir. And so what this means is that like the occupation becomes sort of shared, and it becomes harder to break it down because sort of so many people are involved. And there are other dimensions to this, of course. Your question about soft power. I mean, that's the crux of the matter when it comes to India and how it has been able to get away with so many things for so long. We're not talking just about, language is the latest thing that they have used. But we're talking about the instrumentalization of Indian cinema, right? Especially Hindi popular cinema, Bollywood. And how that narrates a story about like Indian family values, Indian culture, being respectful to your parents, and you can be all of that, but yet you can be operating a completely oppressive caste system, or be completely like pushing Muslims into like periphery roles, but you're nice to your parents. Also the instrumentalization and weaponization of yoga as well. Modi is going to New York soon, and he's going to be, I think, doing something with the UN regarding yoga. Now you think about the symbolism of yoga as well, this kind of like being in touch with yourself, being in touch with your body's rhythm, being like, being natural. Like how can you be so fascist if you like that? If you think about the Nazis and how they used animal rights, Hitler was the first, to I think give. I don't know what the exact phrase is, but he gave some rights to dogs in Germany, and so Modi also projects himself in that way, where he's also very big on the environment, very big on the preservation of like tigers or leopards in India. I don't know which one, but yes, the soft power is an immense thing. It's very, very, very hard to crack. And you think about, on the contrary, you think about Pakistan and how the narrative of Pakistan is just about like a terrorist state, just harboring terror. So when you also bring in Kashmir into the discussion, if India says that a terror attack has taken place and it has been, it was instrumentalized by Pakistan, your ability to discount that, is very, 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 very difficult. So we are in a state of disbelief when it comes to India, to a large extent. Unless you're Kashmiri, unless you're Indian Muslim, unless you're Dalit or Indian Christian, you're not going to believe a lot of the things that are coming out. So with the media also projects India in soft tones, and then you have independent media, or you have these like videos on Instagram or wherever it is that pushes against a narrative. It's very hard to break it because the international media is not actually supporting that. If you think about it, the New York Times, up to today, the New York Times projects Palestine in a very particular way that's very much, pretty much based on the US State Department's point of view, or it's very much in terms of the foreign policy point of view. If you think about Shireen Abu Akleh, no matter what she was wearing, no matter what she was doing, you have to project her as this sort of perfect victim in a way. Otherwise, you're not going to believe that she did nothing wrong. So I think when you think about that aspect and how much has been done with regards to trying to defeat the narrative about the anti-Palestinian narrative that has been pushed across. In talking about Kashmir, talking about Indian Muslims is far lower down the road. It's almost close to impossible at this stage.
Thank you. And now we can open the floor to the audience and collect some questions. We have a volunteer. Respondent, we can collect 3. How about we collect 3 questions and then allow Azad to respond.
Hi Azad, that was a very interesting presentation, thank you for that. Sorry for not reading your book, but one question I had, I was wondering, does your book cover the role of Bollywood and how it's instrumentalized in terms of normalizing that relationship between Israel and India? Because I know that a few years ago, Netanyahu was opened with open arms by the godfathers of Bollywood. So it'd be really good to hear your thoughts on that. If you've not written about it, what are your reflections on that? Thank you.
Next question. We have one here and then in the back.
Hi, thank you for this great talk, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. You mentioned in your remarks at the beginning about the sort of how you see Zionist and Hindu organizations outside of India and Israel collaborating closely, and how now Hinduphobia is becoming weaponized as sort of as a way to end conversation and shut down criticism in the same way that anti-Semitism is weaponized by Zionists. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how, do you have any insights into the ways that this is, especially in the US, I think we see this, sorry, it's not a well-formulated thought, but in the US especially, we see this being done through sort of weaponizing existing diversity and at universities, and in institutions are being pressured to adopt certain definitions of anti-Semitism that make it impossible to talk about Israel in anything other than a positive light. And I saw recently that the Hindu American Foundation's education director is now working for the Anti-Defamation League. So do you think that Hindutva organizations are going to follow a similar path in terms of following this liberal institutional approach to getting their narrative about Hinduphobia? Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I have read your book and I have one question from the second chapter, where you mention 26/11 of India as 9/11. I wanted to ask any particular reason, because in my opinion the magnitude of the killings were very different, and the geopolitics and the repercussions were also altogether very different, and that is what India has been trying to do for AIDS altogether, exaggerate everything. With due respect, all sympathies for the victims, but India has been exaggerating the numbers all through, even recently with the movie coming out, Kerala Story, where they exaggerated the women who were trafficked by ISIS from 3 to 32,000, which is a huge generalization that has already been happening. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. We invite Azad to respond.
So the first question on Hinduphobia, before I get into that, would you like to give me your input on the British context?
Well, in this country, IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has been passed by the Labour Party and by a number of institutions. And what this actually means is that any criticism of Israel is considered to be anti-Semitic. And what we in South Asian Solidarity Group have, well, we happen to be present at a private meeting which the Hindutva, some of the Hindutva organizations had organized with someone from who is basically a Zionist activist, and they were saying to this man, "Can you help us? Can you teach us how we can get Hinduphobia also recognized in the same way, so that criticisms of Modi and of India would be regarded as Hinduphobic?" So we actually heard them saying this, and increasingly we see that's exactly what's happened. I mean, even any criticism of Modi is regarded as anti-Indian and anti-Hindu, Hinduphobic. And now, most recently, even criticisms of Adani are being considered to be anti-Indian and Hinduphobic. So, I mean, that's the scene from Britain, which some of you no doubt are aware of.
Okay, so for the question in the back, I take your point. You are asking why I named, or why I referred to it as 9/11. So I use India's 9/11 under quotation marks, and I also say as it became known. So I'm not endorsing it. Yeah, but you're right, the Indian government has tried to portray it as that. Israel has also tried to portray it as a big deal because Israeli citizens were killed in that attack. But no, I don't refer to it in my own. Thank God for quote marks. In terms of the Bollywood question, yeah, so your friend Amitabh Bachchan met with Netanyahu, right? And a bunch of Bollywood actors met with him, and he traveled. And after that, the Israeli Prime Minister opened up a special fund to encourage Indian films to be made in Israel, right? I don't know what has happened to that fund today, because Israel doesn't know what's going on with anything right now in terms of like it's any of these like peripheral projects, right? But they see India as a huge market in terms of selling the idea of Israel, as well as expanding the idea of Israel to other places. So what I mean by that is if you go to many parts of the African continent, whether it is Senegal in the west, or you go to Kenya in the east, or South Africa, you mentioned India, and they'll know Gandhi, perhaps, and they know Bollywood, they know Shah Rukh Khan. And so that power, that means that they are then going to be the consumers of those visuals from Israel, right? And so there was a film that came out 2 years ago, just before the pandemic or so, and one song was shot in Israel. But the way that they projected that film was that the entire film was shot in Israel, just one song. But that became the selling point to watch the film. The second thing I would say is that you might have seen the show Fauda, this Israeli show, set in the occupied West Bank and then also then set in Gaza. Very, very popular in India. And an Indian filmmaker basically worked with the filmmakers of Fauda and made an Indian version of it. It's called Tanav, and it's set in Kashmir. And so so the cultural reproduction is actually, it's horrifically unoriginal also. It's kind of like you take the same kind of structure, and Kashmir and Palestine are not the same, and things don't work the same, right? So you take the same kind of ideas about like how a collaborator would work, and how how they get into the mind of a terrorist or whatever it is. They use the same logics, and this doesn't make any sense. Obviously, it's terrible to watch. I had to pay to watch it, unfortunately. But that is an ongoing project. You might notice that, no, I think I'll stop there, that's fine. What was the other question? Hinduphobia.
How they, I guess you spoke about how the Hindu nationalist lobby emulates the Israeli lobby.
Yeah. So as part of the discussion about like Hinduphobia, it goes back to how this relationship was also fomented in the U.S. So I think I have to give a little bit of background context, unless you promise to buy the book, then you can read it there. But basically in the early 90s, you have three streams kind of converging. You have the Hindu nationalist movement in India, as well as neoliberalism and the market, opening of markets and privatization in India, right? We have that thing happening, right? In the late 80s, early 90s. Then you have Hindu Americans who are now affluent, who have been in the country for 30 years, many of whom ran away from India in the 70s because of the emergency years under Indira Gandhi. So they ran to the US and they built up, and they started off building this overseas branches of the BJP, even though not officially, but like they started building up the HSS, the VHPA, these things started working from the 70s. So by the 90s, these organizations are largely operational, they have money, right? And they want two things. They want to align their cause with the US. So they want to have influence in the US. You have these poor Indian Americans, not poor materially, but poor Indian Americans, meaning that they don't have any influence in the US, but they want to exert their influence in the US, right? So that's one. And they want to exert their influence in India and make sure that Hindu nationalist project in India continues. And that when they have dollars and they want to invest in that, because they see the Congress as slow and left and too bureaucratic, and they see this perfect alignment of privatization, this neoliberal economy, and identity politics, coming together, and they want to be part of that. Now, as part of that, part of those two things, those two streams, you have the Zionist Jewish community in the US who want desperately India to be an ally to them. So they want India to be close to Israel because it validates Israeli democracy. You have the largest democracy in the world in your pocket. That means, you have a lot of validation. And then we go back to discourse, right? The discourse of India being pro-Palestine, even if it's not necessarily completely pro-Palestine, but the idea that it's pro-Palestine, just the idea means that other places in the world, should they not be so pro-Palestine anymore, they also may not be pro-Palestine anymore, because India is such a huge political, such a force, right? Politically and also in terms of cultural power. So you have these three streams converging, and so it's the Zionists who help Indian Americans, which is to say Hindu Americans, who are aligned with this project. They're the ones that teach them how to lobby. They're the ones that show them how to start a PAC, political action committee, right? They're the ones that provide the first internships on Capitol Hill for Indian Americans. It's an APAC consultant that does that. You're right about this ADL thing. That goes back also a couple decades, because you have the ADL, but you have the Hindu Defamation League that also comes up. Again, not much originality. Things then take off after 9/11, because then you have a civilizational fight. We are fighting against these crazy Arabs, and you're fighting against these crazy Pakistanis, and they're all terrorists. So then there's an alignment of the civilizational discourse. And so even if India does not join the war on terror, it joins the lexicon of the war on terror, the vocabulary, right? And so then that expands, and then by the mid-2000s, you have the borrowing of all the tactics of the Israeli lobby. So one is, for instance, flooding congressional offices and members of Congress with phone calls, email, disinformation, as well as threatening to stop donations to campaigns. Another one is harassing, intimidating, and policing academics and students at universities through the onset of blacklists, online bullying. You might have heard of the Canary Mission, right? Hindu nationalists also have those kinds of things, right? They also come and disrupt events, as they did here. Then you have expensive lawsuits, and accusations of defamation. So they just launch a lawsuit, and you spend half your life and half your savings trying to, just address it, and it's false. Then you have what you are talking about, tainting critics of Hindutva with the Hinduphobia label, as well as claiming to be victims of anti-Hindu hate. Now the thing there is that Hinduphobia expands from speaking about Adani, right, to speaking about caste. It goes all the way, and they decide if it fits or not. The interesting thing about also the Hinduphobia label and the Adani label as well, is that when this Pegasus spyware took place, and members of the opposition party like Rahul Gandhi and some journalists, their phones were infected by the Israelis, is that the right word?
Tactics that are used in Israel, by Israel and by India. And I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit for the audience over here about what parallels you see or specific tactics that you see that are used to suppress local leadership, local resistance, dissent, or any kind of resistance to the authorities of India and of Israel.
Do you have any further questions?
One thing which I've noticed about the book, which is really interesting, is the way, sorry, is that on? Something which comes across quite strongly in the book is the kind of emergence of even stronger relationships with the emergence of the neoliberal era. And in fact, maybe that's why it's called the new relationship, new alliance. And in that context, we see the relationship between Israel and India grow ever stronger. And to what extent does this alliance contribute to the rise of a string of ultra-right regimes? And what effect will this have on global capitalism?
Thank you. And let's try to keep our answers relatively brief so we can get more questions. We have until about 8:30, I believe, the room was in right.
A lot of answers are the strategy, so you don't get more questions. Okay, so quickly, at the end of the day, Hindu Indians ultimately also are not going to be safe if they don't fit as part of the the format or the template of what Hindutva wants. And you know that there are Israelis that are not allowed to go back as well, right? So no one is safe ultimately. And so in the end, they'll be like, today it's, this is how xenophobia works in many ways in different places. And this is not just about like India and Israel, it's also about like ethnonationalisms in the states and how states build themselves. And so today it's, okay, that person should be here, shouldn't be here. Tomorrow it's, that person shouldn't be here. And tomorrow, my right arm shouldn't be here, This right arm is coming in the way of the productivity of my left arm, So it's like a slippery slope. In terms of Kashmir, I guess I'll answer the question in a different way. And I think, and it's probably more urgent to talk about this, and that is next week, India is the president of the G20. This group of 20 nations, the biggest economies in the world, 19 countries and European Union. And they're hosting this event in Kashmir, and it's about tourism. And imagine that 100 delegates from around the world are going to come to Kashmir between 22nd and 24th of May and they're going to be prancing around the Dal Lake, and they're going to go up to the mountain and take a ride on those gondolas, and they're going to walk around and they're going to see the Indian military having beautified bunkers and you know, like flowers painted over bunkers, and they're going to have a curated trip, you know, of Kashmir, and to think that this is 2/3 of the world's population represented by the G20 countries, 80% of the global economy represented by these 20 member states, and they are essentially going to rubber stamp the normalization of this occupation and the settler-colonial project. So while these foreign delegates are going to be traveling in Kashmir, they are going to be going to places in which the UN, international journalists, international human rights organizations have been not allowed to visit for several years. But now they are going to come, and they're going to basically, you know, go back and tell stories about Kashmir being kind of normal. So, I mean, Kashmir is like, you think about the coverage that we are getting, you're thinking about the type of repression that's there right now. You know, it's in a dark space, right? So I think people should look out for that, for the campaign regarding the G20 next week. The third question, and that is about how these things are working together, how these authoritarians are working together. So I'll go back to, you know, this Hyperport business as well as the arms. So one of the things from 2015 to 2019, the arms trade between India and Israel increased by 175%. And so we're talking about between $1 and $2 billion a year, and India purchasing around 46% of all Israeli arms sold, or all Israeli arms produced. At some point, around 2010, one Indian writer suggested that the Indian government or the military were buying more arms from the Israeli companies than the Israeli army was buying from the Israeli companies. So that's one aspect, that's fine. But the thing that's extremely dangerous and speaks directly to your question, and that is about the arms that are being co-produced by Israel and India. So you have drones being produced in India, you have sensors, you have machine guns, and some of those machine guns and these other like really big weaponry are being now taken to Kashmir. And the plan is that you export those weapons to other places in the world, whether it is Latin America or whether it is to unfriendly countries traditionally unfriendly to Israel, but will go through the Indian supply chain. But what does that mean? You know, these are just weapons. No, they're not weapons. Israel doesn't sell weapons. Israel sells a technology. It's a technology of surveillance, a technology of how to treat protesters, how to treat dissent. So when you buy into those technologies, you are importing the way to govern as well. And that's why it's so easy for India to be governing in this way, because the technology is so linked, to the methodology, basically. And so, I guess the last point before Nate shuts me down is that India becoming the biggest country in the world in terms of the largest population, for me has major repercussions. And I don't think I could be completely wrong, but I feel as if we're not actually grappling with the idea that the biggest, or the country in the world with the biggest population is still regarded in so many circles as a democracy. Now, when you think about China, whatever China does, you're not looking at China in the way that you're looking at India. You're looking at India as something to follow. You're looking at India as something to imbibe. You're looking at the culture, you're looking at the cuisine, you're looking at so many things. China, you're not looking at China as a way to improve your life. But in India, there's so many ways in which it's in all our daily life. And so what's happening in India, if India is allowed to remain a democracy in that way in terms of popular imagination, then democracy will be exported, that version of democracy will be exported to other places where you will see the media being suppressed, you will see civil society being dismantled, you would see things like you are seeing now in the UK with regards to the monarchy. Like if you stand up against, like if you say something against the monarchy, then you're going to be arrested for it. I mean, those are not natural things of democracy, but there's a reason why those things exist and why they are able to move across. It's not like someone saying, here's how democracy works, here, take the whole thing and move across. You're saying, this works, that works, I'll pick and choose. And because we're getting away with it in that way. And it's obviously linked with how corporations are essentially running the show. So.
Thank you. Now for the audience, here we have one here, one there, and over here. First, right here, in the middle. The bottom.
Thank you, Azad, for the presentation. My question is, like, you talked about the homogenization of a society by both the projects, Zionism and Hindutva, like the psychological domination by the European Jews over the Arab Jews in Israel, 48 or West Bank, and the similar thing about the Hindi-speaking belt trying to export and dominate psychologically the other Hindus in India, the Hindutva project. But like we don't see that domination in South India, like recently the result in Karnataka. But like, do you think like the Hindi-speaking belt can dominate Hindutva over South India and like homogenize the whole society? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for a thought-provoking conversation. I guess I'm trying to grasp at some semblance of hope here and was wondering if you could speak on alliances between anti-Zionist and anti-Hindutva networks, especially in the diaspora. And the reason I bring this up is obviously the more recent sort of, what you see in the US happening with caste being recognized as a form of discrimination in certain universities and in certain states. So I'm wondering if there's any hope there in terms of these alliances. Just something hopeful there. Thank you.
Hi, Azad Essa, it was really good reading your book, full of so much research. Basically, I just wanted to ask you about this, going back to this question of global capital and the rise of right-wing forces. This point that you make about India, right from the beginning, being having elements to which they were not pro-Palestine or developing some links with the forces in Israel. I just wanted to say, to what extent, the government in India, after the whole struggle against colonialism and the constitution being written by Dr. Ambedkar, was quite progressive, and the attempt was to develop some kind of a pluralistic society. And in whatever failings it had. And then the reference to the whole change in the government in 2014 and its fascistic agenda. Surely there's a distinction there, no?
Okay, so the question about South India. So obviously that's good news that what has happened in the last week. But I'm not an expert enough. I'm not expert enough to comment on what this means. I'm not sure. What we do know is that there's a lot of effort into create this sort of like pan-Hindu, pan-India identity. And there's a lot of movement towards trying to get the South on board. But to the extent to which, it's successful or not, I don't know, to be honest. In terms of alliances in the US, so there's a lot of work being done in the US, and anti-Zionist Jews are speaking out a lot more than before, and obviously they're a lot more vocal, and it's obviously also to do with the generational shift that's taking place in the US, where you have a lot more younger people who are, joining up with other rights issues like Black Lives Matter, and feeling that they can't be, part of Black Lives Matter movement and not be pro-Palestine as well, for instance. But in terms of that connection with India, that has not taken place there. There's a lot of sort of disinformation about that, and obviously a lot of confusion on their side. Plus, as a young Jewish person speaking out about Palestine is already complicated enough. A lot of people are, have a lot of difficulties with their families and all of that. When it comes to the Indian American diaspora, it's broken up into several categories. So you have the older generation that are like by and large Hindu nationalists, in that way, from whatever polls that we have. And then you have those in the middle who are also Hindu nationalists to a large extent, but you have the younger folks who are a lot more open, and also like veering towards being pro-Palestine and being with the Black Lives Matter movement, and then trying to navigate this issue that's happening in India. Part of the agenda of the Hindu nationalist and Hindu supremacist organization is that they create organizations that are seemingly innocuous. So you just go to the temple, or you go to the community center, and you're just doing, you're praying, you're doing yoga, or you're learning about India, and it's only when something happens in India and that organization doesn't speak up about it, or the whispers suggest that they are in line with that, that's when the younger people pick up on it. But there's a large population that's okay with it, and I think people have to accept that there's a lot of Hindu nationalists in the US. And so, at the same time, I know you wanted hope, but part of that is we have to also recognize that a lot of money is going from the US to India. And so in the past, or 20 years ago, it was mostly money from the Gulf that was going to India, like the biggest amount of remittances from all the Gulf countries. But today it's Texas and New Jersey and California. Now there's another thing that has added a complication to this story, and that is that you have a lot of tech workers that are coming in to the US, and they are bringing, now this is, with caveat that I'm not saying we should be against migrants or something, but they are bringing Hindutva with them. So they're a young generation that's coming in, highly skilled engineers, right? And a recent study found that engineers in the US, Indian American engineers, also had a higher support rating towards Modi, and you can understand that, right? So they are bringing Hindutva, and they are the ones that are working in Google, working in Facebook, working in Instagram. They are the ones working in algorithms and deciding what we share, right? So there's a problem. And so in terms of the movement with regards to speaking up about Hindutva, especially, or the connection, the connection between Zionism and Hindutva is, we're at the beginning of that project, talking about it. People still have to talk about Hindutva, people are still battling to talk about caste, so yeah, there's a long way to go with regards to that. But there is some silver lining here and there.
Can I just say something?
Sure.
You can go ahead. We'll hear from Mirza first.
Well, just a comment about the question that you asked about Karnataka. I wouldn't read it too optimistically for multiple reasons. One, that Karnataka has a history of removing incumbent leaders or governments. But more importantly, even if a left government, Congress is not left by any standard, but even if a left government were to come in South India, speaking in context of Kashmir, those positions aren't progressive or actually even supporting self-determination either. So what would be required from the left in that case would be a fundamental change on the understanding that they have to premise self-determination as the way forward for Kashmir, which we don't see happening right now. So even if the BJP is voted out, it doesn't resolve the problem. Of course, there's momentary, you can rejoice momentarily that a government which is very openly advocating or enabling the dehumanization of Muslims and of Kashmiris is voted out. But the Congress or the left isn't taking positions that benefit us either. So it requires a fundamental change in that process. And just secondly, on South India itself, the BJP is actually working very meticulously to change psyche and polarize people in South India. The Kerala story, the movie, the question that came out in the beginning, people who have come out from watching the movie, the first thing they commented on when they were asked, what did you feel? They said, we are afraid, hame Musliman se dar lag raha hai. We are afraid of Muslims now by watching the movie. So it centers an imagination which is anti-Muslim, or at least which enables dehumanization of Muslims. So there is an active campaign going on there as well. So even if they're not in power in the government, there is work going on the sidelines as well through Bollywood, through soft power. And of course, the alternative to the BJP also does not really support self-determination on Kashmir. So it isn't quite helping us either there. So that's why I feel that we require a much larger fundamental change over there.
I just want to say a couple of things about both of these questions. One was about the diaspora. Now, I think it's important for us to remember that in Britain, the nature of the diaspora is very different from the diaspora in America. People came here as workers, and a large proportion of the diaspora are still working class. And because of that, we find different methods used by the Hindu forces. For example, they tried to create a punch-up in Leicester, and we're going to possibly see more of that kind of thing. Because a lot of the people in Leicester who were, in a way, thrown under the bus by the Hindu forces were poor, low-caste Hindus, who were made to do some of the dirty work. So there are lots of complexities, and whereas in America you have people who migrated who were, like IT engineers and all of that kind of thing, middle-class people. So, I mean, that's my first point. The other point I wanted to say was, yes, I think the question of Kashmir is not going to be solved that easily anyway, right? I totally agree with what Saaib has just said. But if you're talking about the domination of Hindi, which is where I think you started the question, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. Because the whole of the South would be up in arms. They don't want India as to dominate them. Bengal is there as well. Bengal doesn't want it. So basically, it's the Hindi heartlands which is affected, and possibly also Maharashtra. I think they may well adopt it. But other than that, it's not going to happen. But that homogenizing of Hindi, of course, goes with Hindutva. So I think in a way the fact that Congress has won Karnataka may not be such a huge thing, but it still is something. Because now the whole of the South is non-BJP. Bengal is non-BJP. And we just have to see what happens. I don't know, there's so many other things. It was a really interesting meeting, and it's like, we could go on about so many things.
Okay, another show of hands from the audience. There was 1, 2, 3.
So, which one's the first one?
Over here.
Hi.
Red button.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I was just wondering, out of academic curiosity as well, if you could also draw some parallels and differences between the ideologies of Hindutva and Zionism while we discuss all this. And from the discussion that just emerged, I was just wondering if we're talking about Kashmir and Palestine and geopolitical situations. You mentioned that there's UAE in Kashmir and there's a lot of permutation and combination and changes going on. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether, and also because we're discussing culture and language not becoming a dominant factor, there's still politics around culture, identity, language, etc. But ultimately, we are seeing, like he's talking about, the fact that BJP is working very hard to establish itself everywhere, and that is only possible with money and with local collaborations. So in this sense, locally, at national level and also globally, what is the role of capitalism in enforcing and allowing and permitting and pushing these structures of oppression around the world, and how they manifest in Palestine and Kashmir? And despite differences in situations and ideologies, how do they make way for collaborative oppression, if that's something?
Thank you. In the front, right here. Let's try to keep our questions as brief as possible.
I'm not sure who would like to respond to this question, only for Azad. Today I read the news that the film Kerala Story has been allowed to screen in UK. And this is despite the fact that only 1 week ago there was a report that British secret agencies have confirmed that BJP Hindutva supporters in Leicester had incited the riot in August, and one of the intelligence officer was also quoted saying that they have become too ambitious and are able to create a Gujarat-like situation here in order to bring their own councillors. So, and if you look at it, it is not only some individuals in the public who are supporting it. Hello?
Turn off.
Yeah. Labour MPs have been supporting Hindutva. There are elements in the government who are supporting it. Before his election campaign, our Prime Minister chose the exactly Hindutva method of lobbying, going to do cow worshipping and publicizing it. So how is it going to impact community relations in UK?
Thank you for really interesting discussion. I have a very short question, which is to take you back to South Africa and ask you, I haven't gotten a chance to read your book, but I noticed that the first chapter is about partitions. And both of these partitions, 47, 48, you also have the apartheid project formally established in 1948. And whether this policy of segregation and separation whether or not you found anything there, and then also obviously, of course, after that, whether the apartheid security regime, whether there's any kind of interlinkages for the end of apartheid, of course, between the three countries.
Yeah, these are very good questions. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to answer them properly because they speak to too many things, I think. I'll go backwards. So I don't know of a connection between the apartheid regime and sort of the RSS right in India. I doubt that they had much connection. If they did, that would be quite interesting. Definitely, the Israelis and South Africans worked together. Apartheid South Africa was extremely important to the Israelis. The South Africans were helping the military-industrial complex continue to grow in Israel to a large extent, and the Israelis were trying to provide South Africa with a nuclear weapon as well at some point. I don't think it actually happened, but they tried. So definitely that relationship was deep. And Israel, I don't even know if Israel actually came on board until the last second, perhaps. In terms of like castigating apartheid South Africa in the late 80s. The interesting part of the question for me is that I do mention, and I did try to read up a little bit about sort of the Afrikaner Puritans and how they kind of had connection with the Zionist project as well. So they all saw themselves, all these settlers had this sort of similar kind of logic, going out into the frontier and meeting the savage. And so even Herzl writes in his diary that he wrote a letter to Cecil John Rhodes, and he said to Cecil John Rhodes, I need help, with this colonizing project, and you are the person I think could help me, right? And Cecil John Rhodes didn't write back, but 2 years later he died, right? So that relationship never developed. But definitely, there's this connection between all these like settler movements. Okay, and in terms of like Hindutva and Zionism, one of the things that really links them up is kind of like the glue between them is this Islamophobia. It's an extremely, extremely important part of both projects, and both kind of try to see themselves as like trying to align themselves with like the global racial elite. That's one aspect to it. In terms of the question about global capitalism, because your question was very, very expansive. Of course, the global capitalism is completely part of this thing, and it is able to instrumentalize the many meanings of Zionism and the many meanings of Hindutva as well. And so it's not surprising that when Netanyahu went to Delhi in 2018, he went to a meeting with the Observer Research Foundation, ORF, and essentially he went there and he basically pushed out a plan about how, trying to align our two countries, our two civilizations, also meant kind of expanding the market economy, also about making it easy to do business. It was very much aligned. And then within 2 years, you see Reliance buying up, military hardware from Israel, or partnering in startups with like Motorola and helping with the technology on the walls. So essentially, they've used religion, they've used aspects of like emancipation and freedom, and tied it up with capitalism. And so that's like a running theme. I hope I answered it to some extent. Don't recall the other question, but I do think I owe an answer here to the man in front. One of the differences between India and Israel in terms of the relationship before Modi came into power, the difference between Modi in power and Congress in power was essentially the public posture of the state. So between 2000 and 2010, India purchased $10 billion worth of arms But Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister, who was the Premier of the state between 2004 and 2010, was never seen with any Prime Minister of Israel, would never go to Israel. So the difference ultimately, so after 2014, is that you are essentially aligning yourself with the state, aligning yourself and wanting to be seen as a militaristic state just like Israel. So ultimately, in the end, it's kind of like what Vladimir Jabotinsky writes, there's no difference between our vegetarians and our militarists. We both know that ethnic cleansing needs to take place. We both know that a certain thing has to happen, but we just differ on the method of doing so. And in many ways, India, of course, had all these, espoused all of these values after independence and had this sort of progressive constitution and all of that. But Dalits and Muslims remain at the bottom of the run. Hindu symbols and all of that are essentially, in every facet of the state. Upper caste Brahmins have dominated in business, in culture, in everything, in politics. So, yeah, so it's kind of like a make-believe also. I can't remember what other question it was. I think it's past your bedtime.
You have to repeat it?
Maybe
you want to answer this question?
Which question?
The impact of Kerala files being screened in the UK. Impact on the UK.
Yes, yeah, sure. Yes, I think that's a really. Oh, sorry. Is it? Yeah. No, that's fine. No, just.
Test. Okay. Now.
Yes, it's okay. It's brought it as well. Yeah, I think this is a very dangerous situation because we see the Kerala files being shown at the same in the same areas where the Hindutva forces are holding these dreadful meetings about grooming. So this is something. In fact, we are planning to have some sort of action around that. I just also wanted to say very quickly, because I think we're about to end, is that while there are enormous similarities between Israel and India and Zionism and Hindutva, one thing we mustn't forget is that Israel pretends that the Israelis pretend that Palestine doesn't exist, right? And within Israel, the standard of living is pretty good on the whole. Whereas in India, it's completely different because there are huge inequalities, there are massive struggles going on, and in fact, it has sunk under Modi. It has sunk on the global hunger index to a very low level. So we have to be aware that we cannot simply equate Israel and India, despite obviously the enormous similarities here. One other small point is, which was really again about Kerala files and the whole question of gender, is that Israel is deeply involved in this country in shaping Islamophobic views of gender. For example, they have a film called Honor Diaries, which they are projecting and trying to show in all Asian women's refuges, meaning shelters for women facing violence. And at the same time, the Cosmopolitan magazine held a day for victims of honor-based violence. And this was funded and supported by an Israeli supporting think tank, the Henry Jackson Society. So they are, someone messaged me before I came here and said, Israel is everywhere. And this is actually, unfortunately, quite true in many ways.
So just to add to that, another important thing to look at when this kind of propaganda is projected outside India is that it's not just for the consumption of diaspora, of Indian diaspora over here, it's also for the consumption of a Western audience. and a parallel that we can see with Kashmir is that when Kashmir Files, just a similar kind of propaganda film that was created about Kashmir, when that was showcased in the UK, non-South Asian audiences that saw the movie, that watched it, would go and talk to their Indian friends or South Asian friends and talk from the sense that whatever was depicted in the movie had some kind of authenticity to it. So it also is meant to convert or to persuade Western audiences for that narrative, that there is some relevance to it. And Western audiences, people in the West also, they also have their own biases against Muslims. So those people who already have reason to believe certain things or hold on to biases will entrench them, and it creates a much more difficult space then to counter that. And these societies are very prevalent over here, who will then start working together. So one important thing to look at when these things are done outside India is that it's not just meant for the diaspora, but also for a Western audience which will project that propaganda at a global scale.
Thank you. We will now have to close the meeting. We're out of time. If maybe perhaps if you have extra questions, you could meet and talk to the panel in the lobby. Thank you for this wonderful work that you've written and the discussion that we've had today. I think we've talked about a lot of